brief presentation, my goal is to give you a high-level overview of the concept of universal grammar. And the individual who popularized this concept is Noam Chomsky. And universal grammar is also known as generative linguistics, and it's related really to the study of genetics and the innate capacities of our mind. So sometimes you will hear this also referred to as an innatist approach to linguistics. At any rate, Noam Chomsky challenged the behavioralist approach to first language acquisition. And in that approach, language acquisition is more about habit formation. It is you get a stimulus response type of relationship, and that if there's enough input and positive and negative reinforcement, then a child or a person will imitate and learn the first language or the second language that they're seeking to learn. That's kind of the behavioralist approach. What Chomsky suggested is that language acquisition is not simply a matter of stimulus and response. And as a matter of fact, when he observed children, he noted that children are constantly coming up with new ways of saying things. And as a matter of fact, if you correct a child, a lot of times they will just keep saying the phrase the wrong way, even though they've never heard anyone say it incorrectly before. So it shows that there's not just a simple imitation going on here. There's something else going in the way the child's learning to put together language. And then the fact that they're not responding to correction indicates that the behavioral strategy isn't quite enough. Interestingly, these children eventually end up learning the basic structures of their first language. And so somehow they work out that incorrect component of language or their language use across time. And it seems like it's something going on in their brain that helps them to do that. So as children learn their first language, the language develops in a kind of systematic way. And that developing language is what we sometimes call interlanguage. And the interlanguage is that mental um, understanding of how language works. And it is a kind of internally consistent understanding or theory of how the grammar of a language works. And it's not something that's conscious, it's more subconscious. It's in the brain. And in Chomsky's view, it's related to how the brain is wired to learn a language. So he came up with this concept of universal grammar. And Chomsky, in this idea, suggests that all human beings inherit a universal set of principles and parameters that control uh, and shape the shape that human languages can take, and which are what make human languages similar to each other. So when you look at human languages, actually they're quite similar, but they're different. And he came up with two really important concepts to explain what's going on with universal grammar and how we end up with different languages. And the first is this idea of principles. And this is the idea that languages actually vary in limited ways, and that there are some things that are true of all human languages. If you compare all the languages in the world, you will discover, for example, that there is something that linguists call structure dependency. And this tells us that all languages have sentences that consist of noun phrases and verb phrases. There are other examples of principles that are known out there, but what Chomsky also identified is that we have this principle, right? That there's structure dependency. Now there are also parameters, and the parameters are the areas in which languages differ. So parameters tell us how languages are different. So for example, there's a parameter called the head parameter, and the head parameter then determines whether a language will be a right branching language or a left branching language. And this is how languages then become different. English is a right branching language. What that means is we build sentences to the right. So we say, the woman who is sitting over there is reading a book, right? It's all the sentence is moving in the direction of the right. Um, Japanese, interestingly, is constructed in a reverse order. So if the Japanese were to say that exact sentence, they would say, um, sitting over there, the woman is reading a book. And so they um, build it in kind of reverse order. And so that's what we mean by right branching and left branching. And the way universal grammar explains this is the brain has the principle there, right? That there is a kind of structure dependency. And then as a child starts to receive input, and they receive input from their parents, from people around them, they're receiving input even in the womb. And the brain, it's like the brain has switches there. And the brain identifies, oh, this language that I'm receiving input for is a right branching language. So if you're a child living in the U.S., the um, the switch gets set to a right branching language. If you grow up in Japan, the switch gets set to a left branching language. And then the brain knows how to construct sentences in that language, and it begins to work that out. The same concept works with other parameters within language. We don't have time to get into that at this point. But that's the idea of universal grammar, that there is this innate language acquisition device built into our brains. There are all these universal principles that are there, and then there are these parameters which are kind of like switches in the brain. And as we receive input, then the brain knows which way to set them. That's the problem that we discussed previously regarding um, the critical period hypothesis. If you don't get that input, the brain doesn't know how to switch those how to set those switches, and then it doesn't know how to acquire the functional part of language. That is a really important concept in universal grammar. So for Chomsky, then, the functional components of language are a closed class. In other words, you can't add to them, and they're closely related to the language acquisition device. The functional part is the grammatical component. It's the phonemes, it's the different sounds that we have and such that we can hear and understand. And so that's why in the critical period hypothesis, then if you haven't picked up certain sounds, for example, like Japanese, um, by the time they're 6 years old, they can't hear a difference between lake and rake. For them, the phonemic difference between an L and an R is set, and so they can hear the difference later, but they can't hear it later. They can figure it out later based on context. And then the same is true with um, the grammatical part. So they know at that early age, oh, this is a left branching language or right branching language. However, even though functional components of language are closed, lexical items are actually an open class. And that means that we can add vocabulary continually throughout our lives and continue to build that. And that is separate, in Chomsky's view, then, from the functional part of language. The last thing I wanted to say here is that it is interesting that there are new languages that emerge among adults. And an example of that is a pidgin language. And there are some situations in which people have moved, for example, to the Caribbean islands, and they were brought there years and years ago as slaves. And when they got there, um, they couldn't communicate well with their masters, um, and then uh, they were separated and mixed together, so they couldn't really communicate with people from their own language group. So they ended up creating a separate language called a pidgin language. And when we look at these pidgin languages are always developed among first um, generation peoples, but they seem to actually follow these rules of universal grammar. It's kind of another proof, I guess, that universal grammar exists. And then pigeons later, this is a little extra information, but when the second generation comes along, they formalize those. They kind of fill out those languages, um, and they become what are called Creole languages. Anyway, that is a strong argument. The fact that even pigeons are embedded in this kind of concept of universal grammar, that they are indeed full languages in their whole right. So this is Noam Chomsky's theory. He's often known as the father of modern linguistics, and he wouldn't use this phrase because he's a bit of an evolutionist. But I will say the big idea here is that God has designed the human brain with the innate capacity to learn languages. I think this is really cool. There are some challenges to this view, but the key ideas here are that we have a language acquisition device. A part of that are these principles that are there for all languages, and then parameters are these switches where when we get input as children, they're set to go right, left, or whatever the others might be. And those settings begin very early in life, as early as 18 months of age. And then we had previously discussed this concept of orders of acquisition and how there is this research by Brown saying that when we learn the different functional components of language, we actually learn them in a kind of set order. That too explains why it is that children come up with these crazy, novel phrases and use words kind of incorrectly, but and we can't fix it. We might try to correct them, but we can't really correct them. But somehow their brain works it out across time, and those sequences show us that there's a consistent order in which children work those out, and their brain helps them work out what the target language is going to look like. This is the concept of universal grammar. I hope this was helpful to you. Thanks.